Good morning, everyone. I'd like to welcome you all to the second day of the Housing Agency Annual Conference. My name is Ursula McAnulty and I'm the Head of Research at the Housing Agency. This session, which is the second of 5 taking place throughout the week, is on preventing homelessness, and it focuses on how prevention is better than cure. Since 2019, prevention initiatives have meant that over half of families in the Dublin region presenting of homeless have been able to stay at home and avoid homeless accommodation. This session will consider the steps that we can take now to consolidate progress made in preventing homelessness, and asks what can we learn from homeless prevention initiatives in other European countries. We are delighted today to be joined by such a distinguished group of speakers. Eileen Gleason, Director of Dublin Region Homeless Executive, who's speaking about homeless prevention in Dublin. Our second speaker is John Mark McCafferty, CEO of Threshold. John Mark will be focusing on prevention methods. And last but by no means least, our final speaker is Ruth Owen, Deputy Director of Vienna, and Ruth will turn our attention to prevention methods in Europe. I have a couple of housekeeping points I'd like to highlight before we begin. We would encourage you to post your questions for our panel in the question section of your control panel on your screens, just to the right-hand side. And please also let us know who on our panel you would like your question to be directed to. And then these questions will be covered in the Q&A session after the 3 presentations. If you do experience any technical issues, we've found that leaving the webinar and then rejoining often works. If you've done that and are still having problems, then please drop us a message in the questions section and type tech at the start of your query so that our events team sees it and can get back to you directly. So without any further delay, let us get started. I'm delighted to welcome our first speaker, Eileen Gleason. Eileen is Director of Dublin Region Homeless Executive, which operates a shared service on a regional basis across the 4 Dublin local authorities. Eileen is responsible for leading the implementation of strategies to address homelessness throughout the Dublin region, with work carried out through 3 main areas of prevention, protection and progression. Eileen has over 30 years' experience working in housing and community services within Dublin City Council and has seen significant changes in social housing delivery over that time. Thank you for joining us today, Eileen, and the floor is yours.
Okay, good morning everybody. And thank you to the Housing Agency for the invitation to speak to you today in relation to what we're doing in the Dublin Region Homeless Executive on preventing homelessness. Ursula outlined there briefly for you what the DRHE does. We operate a shared service on a regional basis on behalf of the 4 local authorities across the Dublin region. We also we work and provide funding to 23 non-profit organisations to deliver in excess of 106 services across the region, and we coordinate and manage the provision of private emergency accommodation for people experiencing homelessness. We drive a housing-led approach to homelessness on a regional basis in conjunction with the service providers, and we work to move people through emergency accommodation with help and support towards sustained exits from homelessness. And our work is carried out on over 3 main themes. I'm not sure if the presentation is moving forward for you.
You just say the words next slide to me, Eileen. I will move them forward for you.
Okay, next slide, please. And next slide again, thanks. Okay, the 3 areas of operation are prevention, protection and progression. There are 3 main operating themes in the DRHE. Prevention speaks for itself, providing early intervention to people at risk of homelessness. Protection is protecting people that we are experiencing homelessness through provision of emergency accommodation and supports. And progression is identifying pathways for long-term housing solutions. Next slide. In our Homeless Action Plan for the Dublin region 2019 to 2021, the strategic prevention theme is to provide early interventions, as I said earlier, to people at risk of homelessness, which is done in two ways: the direct provision or direct intervention to prevent presenting families and single persons becoming homeless, and enhancing statutory interventions and community infrastructures to reduce the risk of people becoming homeless, particularly known vulnerable groups. Next slide. The next slide there just shows the number of families in emergency accommodation from January to September of this year. Each month shows the numbers of new presentations for families, slightly skewed because of COVID in the earlier months of the year from March, April, May. The numbers also show the numbers that exit, so it indicates the amount of work that's happening in the DRHE on a daily, weekly, monthly basis. And then the last column on the right, as we're looking at the screen, shows us the families that were prevented from ever entering emergency accommodation or experiencing homelessness. And that's 689 families to October of this year, to the end of September. The next slide, please. The next slide shows us the singles, the same story for singles from January to September. The numbers of new presentations, which are quite large by comparison to families currently. The singles numbers keep coming. The numbers of adults leaving are not as great as they could be they are on the family side, because it's much more difficult for us to find accommodation for singles. And then the numbers of singles prevented, 604 to the end of September, that never entered emergency accommodation, never experienced it because of the prevention interventions that we have in place. Next slide, please. Right, this just gives you an overview of our budget. So it's not a small number. It's quite a large budget that we have, the majority of which is spent on the middle P there, which is the protection. Prevention in 2020, 6.7 million, and for 2021 we're estimating 7 million. Now that figure does not include the expenditure on homeless HAP, but it does include things like tenancy protection services and our own operations with prevention officers, etc. To date in the Dublin region there's been 10,000 homeless HAPs alone since the commencement of HAP, and that's not an insignificant figure. Next slide, please. Where do people come from? Where do people come from into emergency accommodation or into seeking homeless accommodation or emergency accommodation? They come in the main from the private rented sector due to shortage of affordable and social housing. They come from family relationship breakdowns. They come from from care leavers. They come from prison release. They come from hospital discharge, and they come from inward migration. The majority would come from the first two in that category, the private rented sector and the relationship breakdowns. Next slide, please. So how do we prevent? We prevent with tenancy protection, through threshold, RTB, with MABs, advice, etc. And the other one would be to try and increase the number of affordable and social units coming onto the market. And that is covered by the Rebuilding Ireland plans. It will, in time, give us results. The plan was that there would be 47,000 new social housing units built over the period of the Rebuilding Ireland plan up to the end of 2021. It's coming, but slowly, and we've a pent-up demand that we're catering for in homeless services in the meanwhile. Next slide, please. Tenancy protection service. John Mark will expand on this on his presentation, I'm sure. What tenancy protection service does is that early intervention piece that I mentioned earlier, where people are at risk of homelessness, advising them, ensuring that they have access to whatever incomes they're entitled to, supports they're entitled to, ensuring that they know where they stand on a legal basis. And it's a primary mechanism to defer families from homelessness. Next slide is on homeless HAP, and this slide, I'm going to dawdle on it for a little minute if you'll bear with me. The blue, the left-hand side, as I'm looking at the screen there, shows you the numbers of preventions. So the numbers of people, families and singles who were prevented with HAP tenancies in those periods, 18, 19 and 20. So there's over 4,000. So they're people that we have to appreciate never experienced homelessness. By using our prevention methods, by using HAP, we were able to keep those people from experiencing emergency accommodation. We will never be able to measure the impact, the social impact of having that system there, that mechanism to prevent people experiencing homelessness. But I think it probably speaks for itself. We also, Homeless HAP is a huge tool for us in exiting people out of emergency accommodation as well. Next slide. The family relationship breakdown piece, how do we deal with that? We have a family support teams and prevention officers across the 4 local authorities in the Dublin region. The initial method is to go and meet with them in their homes, especially if the relationships are breaking down, and to try and work with them to keep them where they are, if it's safe, obviously, and work with them to get them into HAP or homeless HAP or whatever type of alternative accommodation we can get them to, as opposed to letting them into emergency accommodation, and work with them rather than opening emergency accommodation facilities for them. And that works across with our prevention teams across the 4 local authorities and our housing support teams. TUSLA, care leavers, there's a real risk with care leavers coming out of care in relation to homelessness, and there's a good system there now in relation to the care leavers, CAS for care leavers, with the aftercare steering committees, of which the local authorities and the DRHE are members. The committees identify the care leavers at risk of homelessness, and then from a housing perspective, we identify with the AHBs, the approved housing bodies, the accommodation, and it's funded through the CAS system. And it is a huge tool in preventing that group from coming into homelessness. Prison release, there's a protocol in place between the DRHE and the Irish Prison Service, which works that we are informed of anybody who's coming out of being released from prison. And if they have no accommodation to go to, it's highlighted before they come out. We can sometimes intervene, it's not always successful, but we can intervene with the prison service, who have a liaison system in place, so that we can try and prevent them from ever coming into homelessness in the first place. Next slide, please. The next one is the hospital discharge policy. So there's a protocol in place, again, between the DRHE and the HSE and the National Social Inclusion Office. And again, the whole idea is to divert people from ever coming out of a hospital environment and into emergency accommodation. It also highlights the need for other special types of accommodation that are needed for people with disability, etc. And we can sometimes, by having that protocol in place, we can divert people successfully to more appropriate accommodation to meet their needs. And finally, inward migration. We provide access to supports for people who are arriving into the country looking for supports. We provide a translation service and advice, mainly through cross care. And that service is there to provide people, to advise them on whether they're entitled or able to access emergency accommodation and other social supports, and to divert them back to repatriate. And we do that, and I'll get to that in a minute, with another organisation. Other prevention, next slide, sorry. The other prevention methods. We have a family support team and a single support team now in the Dublin Region Homeless Executive. Their main role is to identify accommodation and support needs for families and singles. So in theory, you would say they're dealing with our middle P, which is protection. So they're moving people, matching appropriate accommodation and service to their needs. However, as part of that, because they're dealing with our people who are clients that are in emergency accommodation, they form exit plans, and the exit plan takes account of what that particular individual or family need to ensure that they can sustain their exit. So by ensuring from when we're exiting them that we give them the appropriate supports that they need exiting, there's less chance of them coming back around into emergency accommodation and into homelessness in the longer term. Next slide, please. Housing supports available. So what housing supports are available to people who are either in accommodation or at risk of becoming homeless? Support to live independently, which is a medium support, and that's operated through some of the NGOs for us across the Dublin region. HALE, which provides support for mental health, and then we have Housing First for singles. And Housing First is a high to medium support. It's indefinite. It's on-site supported housing, and this far our retention rate in it is at about the 89%, 87 to 89% retention rate. And bearing in mind that we're dealing with people who are entrenched rough sleepers, who need a lot of support and work, Housing First to date is working very well for us and is potentially a huge solution to homelessness, especially for singles into the future. Tenancy, sustainment and visiting supports. This again is to prevent people ever coming into emergency accommodation, into homelessness. Teams work with people, they work with them on the basis of what the crisis is. It could be they could be causing antisocial behaviour, etc. And they work with them in a way that will get the situation under control and link them into community supports, because sometimes that's exactly what's missing. People aren't able to link in with the supports that are in the community for them. And they work, this tenancy sustainment and visiting support teams work on a multidisciplinary basis. So it's a multidisciplinary team. And finally, we have BARCA, which does repatriation and is funded for that purpose. So we fund BARCA to repatriate people who are in need to go back to where they came from, have no entitlement, or actually are quite happy to go back most of the time, and need to, and that organisation reconnects them with their communities, wherever it is that they've come from. It's mainly for Eastern Europeans that is happening. So that's the end of my presentation for today. I'll take questions after at the end of all three speakers. Thank you very much. Thanks, Ursula.
Thanks very much, Eileen, for that really interesting presentation. I think you did a really good job and clearly outlined, in terms of the broad range of different prevention methods that are currently in place, and also highlighted sort of the excellent work that's already been undertaken in relation to homeless prevention, particularly in relation to family homelessness. It's now my pleasure to introduce our next speaker, John Mark McCafferty. John Mark is the CEO of Threshold, the national housing charity aiming to prevent homelessness through advice, tenancy, protection and advocacy. John Mark has over 25 years experience of working on social justice issues in Ireland and Scotland. He's previously worked in the Society of St Vincent de Paul, the Combat Poverty Agency and Scottish Homes, which is the Scottish National Housing Agency. Thanks for joining us today, John Mark. The floor is yours.
Good morning, and thanks, Ursula, and thanks to the Housing Agency for this opportunity to speak about preventing homelessness by protecting tenancies. And also thanks to Eileen of the DRHE for setting out the wider context in which homelessness prevention occurs. So maybe if we just move on to the next slide. So what might spring to mind? I suppose images like this may spring to many people's minds when homelessness is mentioned. When we talk about preventing homelessness, it's important for us to identify the problem of homelessness. And there is, I would argue, almost a fixation on the idea of homelessness as purely the person who's sleeping rough, who has a whole range of complex problems and needs. This fixation is unfortunately both very much in the public imagination, to some extent at policy level, and if I may be so bold, it's arguably reinforced by the sector, by the NGO sector, in an effort to raise funds. And I suppose it's a skewed image. It's a partial truth, but also partially obscures some of the solutions. So in terms of the next slide, pathways into homelessness. In Ireland today, many of those experiencing homelessness are people who lost their home in the private rented sector, as Eileen has mentioned, often through no fault of their own. They are families who now live in hotels or hubs, or recently did so as they now re-enter the rented sector. And those without children who are maybe couch surfing or staying in homeless hostels or other accommodations. They cannot secure a new home due to lack of affordable supply in the rental market and lack of social housing. And if we continue to think of homelessness as only the rough sleeper or predominantly the rough sleeper with a complex set of needs, we will not solve the wider enduring homeless crisis. So in terms of the next slide and what's placing tenants at risk, this has been covered very adequately by Eileen, but from our perspective in 2019, over half of Threshold's clients at risk of homelessness had received a notice of termination from their landlord. The main reason for issuing a notice was on grounds of sale. Unfortunately, a landlord is within his or her rights to issue a notice of termination for sale, own use, and refurbishment, among other grounds, where there has been no wrongdoing by the tenant. In such instances, there is little that can be done to prevent the tenant losing their home. We can only ensure that they receive the appropriate notice and their deposit back, and support them to access Homeless HAP if need be, in order to try to secure a new home. When there is no alternative housing option, however, homelessness can and does occur. And of Threshold's clients at risk of homelessness in 2019, 18% were at risk due to a rent increase, 7% had issues accessing HAP, and 5% were at risk due to rent arrears. These areas are where we need to target our prevention efforts. So in terms of prevention interventions, and the next slide, what's available? Well, there's primary prevention policies. These are wider social policies serving the general population and focus on housing supply and welfare issues. They can also include legislative measures such as strengthened security of tenure, as well as the supply of affordable housing. Secondary prevention policies are focused on households identified as part of at-risk groups, and Eileen has mentioned these in terms of people leaving institutional care, care settings, custodial settings, take the form of educational programs, discharge policies, and aftercare programs. For the last 7 years, people in the rented sector, the private rented sector, have been at unprecedented risk of homelessness. And while those policies that I just mentioned apply to particular groups, they're not a panacea for the wider tenant population who've been at risk of homelessness in recent years. And that's why Threshold has been one of a number of organisations targeting that wider at-risk group and preventing homelessness. In recent years, the DRHE put a dedicated team in place to prevent this group from entering homelessness also, which they've had success with. So what might not spring to mind, and if we move on to the next slide, and you might not have been expecting an image like this, but at the risk of sounding glib, and it's a risk I'll take since it's December now, and the Advent calendars are opening and restrictions are easing. What's the magic pixie dust of prevention? Well, one strain of magic pixie dust I may proffer is Threshold's work. And we provide a bespoke service to those living in the private rented sector who are at risk of losing their home. For many people, we can stop homelessness before it happens. This is the most effective solution to homelessness. And we do this by operating our National Tenancy Protection Service via various channels, including our helpline 1800 454 454, email, online, and our recently launched web chat function, and at our outreach clinics pre-COVID and hopefully post-COVID. So moving on to the next slide, Threshold stops homelessness before it happens in many instances. And specifically, the magic pixie dust is the work of Threshold advisors who are experts in the Residential Tenancies Act, which is a complex and ever-changing piece of legislation, doing the following. They're advising tenants of their rights. They're advocating directly to landlord or agent if need be. They are representing tenants at the RTB and the WRC where necessary. They're advocating for uplifts and rent supplements, devising solutions and supporting tenants to access HAP. They also listen to and understand tenants who are facing huge challenges and suffering extreme stress. All of this, save for the outreach clinics, has continued throughout the pandemic. Obviously, many other statutory and NGO interventions prevent homelessness, and we work in partnership with these players, and I want to acknowledge these. But for the purposes of this input, I'm talking about Threshold's contribution. So moving to the next slide, last year, almost 8,500 households were protected from homelessness. And the result of this intervention is that in 2019, almost 8,000 children and almost 11,000 adults were positively benefited. And without the intervention of Threshold advisors and indeed other players, the number of people experiencing homelessness today could arguably be double. Preventing homelessness before it occurs saves adults and children from the trauma of homelessness, and it is also far more cost effective. It costs Threshold approximately €240 to save a household from homelessness. We estimate it costs the state over €30,000 to place that same household in emergency accommodation. So in terms of solutions, and the next slide, this is one of the key solutions. And studies show that approximately 80% of people who experience homelessness do so only once. In Ireland today, most of these people are likely to have lost their home in the private rented sector for the reasons named above and for the reasons named by Eileen. Another 10% experience homelessness on an episodic basis, and 10% are entrenched in homelessness or are experiencing chronic homelessness. So there's an 80-10-10 split. Providing targeted primary and secondary interventions at this larger group could dramatically reduce and does dramatically reduce homelessness in Ireland and prevent many from experiencing homelessness. Such interventions include strengthening security of tenure in the long term by removal of what we would call no-fault evictions, alongside the provision of affordable, secure housing options. Advice and advocacy services would be required at times of crisis, but the risk of homelessness would be dramatically reduced by some of those structural reforms. The eviction moratorium, introduced earlier this year, is an example of such an intervention. It reduced child and family homelessness by about 25%. It must be said, however, that the moratorium did not have the same impact on the numbers of adults without dependents experiencing homelessness, and that remained largely static. And that's down to the fact that there are even less affordable housing options for those without children than there are with families, as well as the shortfall in HAP payments for that group. Effective primary and secondary interventions targeting this larger group of people at risk of homelessness would free up resources to target other at-risk groups and scale up interventions such as Housing First, supported housing, and tenancy sustainment. So in terms of the next slide, and my parting glass is promotion, promotion, promotion. People can't use the services if they don't know they exist, or if they don't know how to access them. So the public promotion of services such as Threshold's Tenancy Protection Service is absolutely key, and I can't highlight that enough. DRHE promote our services on an annual basis, but we don't have a nationwide promotion system. We don't have the services being promoted in Cork and Galway, and I'm always I wonder, you know, these are services that are funded, and yet the light has been kept under a bushel, if you like. We are indeed hugely appreciative of our funders, the DRHE, the Department of Housing and Local Authorities, CIC, HSE and others, and our donors for their financial support, without which such successful prevention work would not be possible. So thank you very much.
Thanks, John Mark. I thought your presentation was really, really interesting. It's really good to see, you know, all the different preventative measures that your organisation is undertaking and set out sort of the success that this can have in terms of homelessness prevention. I also thought it was interesting in terms of towards the end of your presentation, you had your solutions slide, sort of the different levels of homelessness with episodic or first-time homelessness and the different type of solutions that they could have, but also the different proportions that they represent within the homelessness population as a whole. Thanks very much, John Mark. Before I introduce our next speaker, I just want to take this opportunity to remind you that if you do have questions for John Mark or Eileen so far, if you could put them into the question panel on the right-hand side. So I'm going to introduce our next speaker now, who is Ruth Owen. Ruth is the Deputy Director of Vienna, the European Federation of National Organisations working with homeless people. Ruth helps plan and coordinate Vienna's policy work, working on EU social policies, housing and monitoring homelessness. Ruth has been with Vienna for nearly 12 years, working in a range of communication and policy roles. And I invite Ruth to share your screen. Thanks, Ruth. We can see your screen now. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much for the introduction, and thank you very much for the opportunity to join you today. I'm going to try and complement the excellent presentations that we've already heard by providing a bit of a European perspective on the question of preventing homelessness. So I work for Vienna, which is a European coalition to end homelessness in Europe. We have around 140 members from across Europe. They're mostly NGOs working with homeless people, but also cities, national regional authorities, foundations, neighbouring sectors like health and social housing, research bodies, universities and think tanks. And most of our activities are around research, learning, expertise and knowledge, advocacy and awareness raising. So I think just to put the discussion about prevention into a bigger picture, I think increasing capacity to prevent homelessness sorry, I'm having a couple of problems with my screen, but in order to move from kind of managing homelessness mostly through temporary accommodation towards progressively reducing and ultimately ending homelessness, we need to move towards systems that put most policy emphasis and capacity and resources into both prevention and rehousing people quickly with support as they need it. And this diagram on the left comes from a Canadian researcher, Steve Gates, and I think it captures very succinctly what that transition needs to look like. There are basically 3 levels of homelessness prevention according to the academic literature. Primary, which is basically about preventing new cases of homelessness, and that would be things like the supply of affordable housing, the broader welfare regime, tenancy regulation, etc. But also kind of downstream primary prevention in terms of targeting at-risk groups and intervening in established pathways into homelessness, such as leaving an institution or family conflict. And primary prevention is really important, but I think it's also important to stress that broad primary prevention is not enough on its own. You do need targeted measures that specifically address homelessness, and maybe looking at the situation in some different European countries can help illustrate this. So the Netherlands, which is the EU member state with the most social housing, about a third of the stock is social housing. has seen a doubling of homelessness over the past 6 years. So social housing, having a lot of social housing in and of itself is not enough to prevent homelessness. In Sweden, we see that having a very performant welfare system is not, without targeted measures on its own, doesn't prevent homelessness. And Sweden performs much worse than its other Nordic welfare state neighbours because it doesn't really have a very targeted homelessness policy per se. And the Czech Republic would be another example where it has the lowest relative poverty indicators in the European Union, but a very serious homelessness problem. So it's not necessarily that a more equal society is going to have less homelessness. Secondary prevention is intervening early in new cases. So an example would be intervening during the eviction process, like the project that John Mark just presented. And tertiary prevention is sort of intervening once a case is established. So an example would be the rapid rehousing, which is basically rent support with some light tenancy support for homeless families in the US, which is a program that's had a lot of success and been very much scaled in recent years in the US. Sorry, I'm having some issues changing my slides. I think there are 6 big challenges for prevention. The first one is effectiveness. Like, there's no counterfactual, so how do you actually know if prevention is working? The second one is targeting. Are you reaching the people who need the intervention? And also not too many of the people who don't necessarily need the intervention. This is actually very difficult to get right because whilst the risk factors for homelessness are very well understood, the individual triggers are highly unpredictable. So one person in a given set of circumstances would become homeless where many other people wouldn't. The quality of homeless prevention services, they tend to be quite fragmented. In order to deliver, they need to be timely, individualized and persistent, and they need to have a rights-based approach that puts the needs of the person first. Coverage of services often quite selective in their targeting, and geographical coverage is often very patchy. The efficiency of homelessness services is difficult to measure effectively and to demonstrate because it's hard to, first of all, in relation to the effectiveness programme, just question to be sure whether homelessness would have occurred without the measure. And lastly, gatekeeping. I think it's a really important element of this discussion. There's a fine line between preventing homelessness and preventing people from accessing support that they need. And so, of course, prevention is better than a cure, unless you're already sick and you really need a cure. I'd like to share a couple of case studies from different places around Europe. The first one is eviction prevention services in Vienna. So Vienna has a very effective system for preventing evictions. It looks a bit different depending on whether we're talking about the private and cooperative housing sector or the municipal social housing sector, but the intervention is basically the same. FAVOS is the entity that works on this for the private and cooperative sector. The courts are actually legally obliged to inform municipalities of eviction notices, and then the municipality informs the FAVOS service directly. And they also have other ways of reaching people, like public campaigns, referral from other organisations, referral from family and friends, etc. They work with tenants in a very proactive way. So once they're informed of the eviction notice, they write letters which are followed up by home visits. They provide rapid access to financial assistance with rental areas, and they provide a range of support to the members of the household, like legal advice, conflict mediation, help with budgeting, etc. And Vienna Wohnen is the equivalent service for the municipal housing sector. So in terms of results, this has really driven down the number of eviction processes which actually ultimately lead to an eviction. It was 1 in 4 in 1995, and it's now 1 in 8. The costs to the municipality, it's a very cost-effective programme. To support one household in this prevention scheme costs about €370, whereas reintegrating a homeless person through the accommodation system costs about €460 a month and usually lasts for about 12 months. This is a very simple but highly effective intervention, especially in a city where 60% of tenants are in some kind of social rental housing. And I think the keys to the success are really the speed of the response, which is made possible by this sharing of information from the courts, and the quality of the support, which is flexible, individualised, and very much based on trust and empowerment. My second example is from Wales. It's the introduction of the Housing Act in 2014. This was very much built on the existing homelessness legislation, which is increasingly divergent in the UK in the context of devolution, but basically local authorities have a duty to house homeless households, provided that their homelessness is non-intentional and they're in priority need, which means there is a dependent child, a pregnant woman, or a vulnerable adult in the household. And on top of that, they have to provide temporary accommodation to these households until settled accommodation is secured. But this Act added a layer of duty to local authorities and made prevention services a universal right, with all local authorities required to offer them. And it made funding available to enable them to transition to this new model. So this is a summary of the kind of measures that local authorities should now have in place to prevent and relieve homelessness. And the early implementation of the Homelessness Act is very promising. I'm getting a bit low on time, so I'll skip over the numbers, but it increased enormously the number of households accessing prevention services and led to a 59% reduction in the number of households who remained homeless after applying to the council for help, and reduced temporary accommodation use by 18%. So going forward, it's clearly been a successful effort to include substantial prevention elements in homelessness policy in Wales, but there are a few points to improve in the implementation. There's a need for more effective referral processes, continuing to improve the services. Local authorities tend to stick to a fairly typical set of limited actions, and there's really a need to innovate in the services and tailor the responses more to the needs of individuals. There's a big area of weakness, I think, is in relation to single homeless people. Ultimately, I think there's a need to refine the legislative framework and get rid of the priority need category, as has been done in Scotland, because it really disadvantages single homeless people. The local authorities don't have to provide any temporary accommodation for people in non-priority need, so they can actually remain rough sleeping during the whole prevention and relief process. And some groups are particularly badly served, like prison leavers who have been recently removed from the priority need category, and those with no local connection. There are some very serious concerns around the use of non-cooperation as a gatekeeping mechanism. So basically, if a homeless person is seen not to cooperate with the support that's being offered, that allows local authorities to discharge them without a solution. And there's some evidence of unlawful use of this duty to cooperate. Legislation can only do so much. I think most of the challenges going forward are in terms of implementation, so the quality and the consistency of services and the compliance with the intentions of the law. This legislation has now been copied in England, but without the dedicated funding for the transition and in a context of massive cuts to local authority budgets. So in conclusion, I would say that prevention is better than a cure, but it's not that easy to do. Challenges include the quality of services, the coverage, demonstrating effectiveness and efficiency, targeting and gatekeeping. Evaluations and policy analysis often pay insufficient attention to the risk of gatekeeping. Prevention is generally underdeveloped in Europe and internationally. Some of the most obvious gaps relate to discharge from institutions, prevention of repeat homelessness, and effective eviction prevention. You need all three levels of prevention to be activated in order to achieve an efficient prevention system, and overall policies need to move towards more prevention and rapid access to housing with support in order to shift from managing to ending homelessness. Thank you very much for your attention. I look forward to the discussion and questions.
Thanks very much, Ruth. I'm sure I'm not the only one who was really interested and pleased to see your case study examples. I think the Vienna one's really interesting, particularly the cost savings that can be made in terms of their eviction services as opposed to rehousing somebody once they become homeless. So I think we'll turn now to our Q&A session. So I'd like to invite the three presenters so far to turn on their videos and unmute, and we can get started on the questions. Okay, we have a lot of questions to get through. I'm just going to see which ones are addressing some common issues. Eileen, I think I'll begin with one for you. You were the first speaker. So the question is, would sufficient, secure, affordable accommodation, be it social or private, reduce the risk of homelessness amongst those that have experienced relationship or family breakdown, care leavers, or any of the other categories that you mentioned?
No, is the short answer, because as Ruth said, there's more to it. But yes, of course, it would be a huge help, and having an increased supply of social housing, affordable housing, would definitely have an impact. But lack of housing isn't always the reason for homelessness. There's other health needs, mental health needs, addiction needs that also have to be met. So no is the short answer.
Okay, that's great. Thanks, Eileen. That was an easy one for you to answer there. I think there's a question here, and I think it's either John, Mark, or Eileen will be able to take it. It's in relation to a point that you had raised, Eileen, in your presentation, and you were talking about protocols that are in place for hospital discharge and prison leavers. So that's, the reason for their presentation as homeless. So you were talking about the Dublin region. Are there similar protocols in place across the country, or are they focused on or contained to Dublin?
Will I take that, John Mark?
Sure.
Yeah, there's specific protocols in place with the DRHE for Dublin, and it deals with all the prison discharges from all over the country, if the connection is back to Dublin, if the person. Having said that, there's all those systems are also in place with all the other local authorities, with the prison service. We have no management role in it, but it is there. Yeah.
Okay, thanks, Eileen. We have a couple of questions here that are in relation to the Housing First. I don't think we've really touched on Housing First today. So I suppose what they're saying is Housing First targets a very small cohort of the homeless population. Is there any talk of, or is it possible to be scaled up to address homelessness in general in an Irish setting? And I suppose all panelists would invite to give a response to that in terms of the scaling up of Housing First.
Will I go again? There's a national there's a national Housing First implementation plan. The targets are going to be increased, but the first step in that, because there's so many other collaborations required for Housing First to work with health, addiction, etc., justice, it needs to be embedded across the country. And now we're in a position where every local authority is starting to put Housing First tenancies in place. So once that's established, then obviously it will work to expand it. And yes, it's a huge solution for people who need more than just a roof over their head. And the big emphasis would be on the single homeless people who have other complex needs that need to be met and are entrenched rough sleepers or entrenched episodic users of emergency accommodation. They're in and out. They're going through a lot of the institutions of the state. They're in and out of prison, hospital, detox programs, and back onto the street again into our emergency accommodation out of it. So put the structure in place, the plan in place for the implementation of a national Housing First plan, and then there's huge benefits in extending it then once it's up and running, and that initial phase is nearly there. So yes, for a particular cohort, it won't solve the problems for everybody, but it will solve it for the main group of particularly single households that are in emergency accommodation or use it on an episodic basis.
That's great. Thanks, Eileen. Ruth or John Mark, do either of you want to come in on that issue?
Yeah, maybe just to add, I think Housing First is really interesting in that it's both a sort of quite clearly defined service model, which definitely would target people with higher support needs because it involves a lot of quite intensive support ways of working, like assertive community treatment and multidisciplinary teams and stuff. But at the same time, it's a sort of paradigm and a potentially very transformative idea in terms of homelessness policies more generally, saying that, you know, basically housing first is the answer. And if people need support, that support should be tailored to their individual needs and deployed in a very flexible way. So European-wide, Housing First can look very different in different settings, whilst respecting the kind of key principles, and sometimes the target groups can be very different. You know, Housing First being applied to young people who have complex support needs, also to family homelessness in different settings, like in the Czech Republic, for example. And in Finland, I think it's gone now way beyond the original sort of program model, which was about chronic single homelessness. And it's much more about generally keeping people in their housing, and if they lose their housing, getting them into new housing as quickly as possible. So I think it's, in some ways, it's both.
John Mark, have you anything to add to that?
I would not really. I mean, I think, you know, Eileen and Bob and others within DRHE and the department, they're the leaders on Housing First. So I'll leave it to them.
Just while we're on the Housing First issue, just see one other question's come in. So maybe we'll take that one now and then move on to another issue. What somebody is asking is, in terms of the outcome of Housing First in other countries who have been implementing Housing First longer than we have in Ireland. What do we know about the outcomes of Housing First in those countries that have been operating it longer than we have? Maybe Ruth, you could take that one to begin with.
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think probably the country in the European Union that is the furthest down the road in terms of implementing Housing First is Finland. And after sort of 10 years of Housing First and 2 rounds of programmatic investment on quite a serious scale, including producing social housing units specifically to meet the unmet needs of the single long-term homeless population, they've pretty much reduced long-term homelessness to the few thousands, and I think you could arguably say it's a fairly residual social problem now in Finland. Certainly large-scale shelters are a thing of the past. They've all been closed down. They have these kind of emergency reception centres where people stay for a maximum of 2 weeks before being moved into housing. So that's probably the example of the country in Europe where it's the furthest down the line. More broadly, tenancy sustainment levels are kind of above 80% in most Housing First programmes in Europe and internationally. And then the range of impacts is very big, but also measured very differently in different contexts in terms of the impact on health, on social inclusion, on progress towards employment and stuff like that. I think some of the common challenges that Housing First programs face are around loneliness sometimes, and there are some really interesting models, I think, especially in Southern European countries, about linking people into their community and making sure that they're not isolated in their homes. And yeah, there's so much. It's very unusual, Housing First as a homelessness intervention, in that there is so much evidence about how it works and why it works, and the impact it has on people's lives.
That's great, thanks. Hopefully that's covered the Housing First queries that we had. Ruth, and both John Mark and Eileen, I think in your presentations, and you just mentioned there, Ruth, the idea and the issue of tenancy sustainment. Perhaps you could talk us through what does that mean. Some of us are fairly clear on what it covers and what it doesn't cover, but for the rest of us who perhaps don't have the full remit of what tenancy sustainment actually is, could you maybe give us some examples of different elements of tenancy sustainment and how they operate? Who wants to kick off?
Maybe if I start, I suppose we would talk more about tenancy protection, and I think there's overlap between tenancy protection and tenancy sustainment. My assumptions, and I might be wrong here, but my assumptions when I think of tenancy sustainment is more around almost like one-to-one, almost face-to-face supports and certain kind of wraparound supports around people, around households or people who may have already lost tenancy, may have come through, emergency accommodation. I suppose when I think of tenancy protection, it's really about trying to put various supports and interventions in place which stop the loss of a tenancy from happening. Because I guess now again, I'd be interested to hear what Eileen thinks, but my sense is the sustainment element is around maybe certain particular needs for someone for the certain circumstances, whereas tenancy protection, our work, while we do assist many people with certain vulnerabilities and challenges, lots of people across the board, across the income spectrum, can lose their tenancy through various things like a notice of termination due to the house or the apartment being sold, a landlord or a family member moving in, or indeed substantial refurbishment. Now that's less of an issue now because the legislation changed over the last couple of years. So our focus is the kind of what I call the magic pixie dust. Like the tenancy protection piece is, when you break that down, I kind of named it again. I'm happy to name those areas, but it's things like, is there scope for an uplift in rent supplement? Is the tenant accessing the housing assistance payment and doing so on a timely basis? Is there a dispute that we can assist with and we can help kind of advise them and clarify things for them? Can they present themselves at the RTB or the WRC, or do they require a little more tailored and in-depth supports from ourselves in relation to the kind of representation and the quasi-judicial dispute mechanisms, which, if there's a positive outcome, and there's not always, but if there's a positive outcome and from the point of view of the tenant, that may facilitate them remaining in their home. I mean, sometimes it's they get an award after the fact, so they have actually, you have this strange situation where they're compensated or awarded, but they've lost their tenancy, and it would have been much more beneficial to everyone involved if they'd been able to stay in their tenancy and not have this, that's the main thing rather than the award per se, but at least it's a deterrent, a signal in relation to certain practices or future practices by a small section of landlords. So I guess for us, the protection element is around tailored advice. It's around representation. It's about hearing the stories of tenants. It's around kind of negotiation and representation by, with local authorities, HAP, the Department of Social Protection in terms of, as I say, the uplifts, negotiation, and maybe finding a common ground with the landlord, which facilitates that family or that individual to stay and remain for the longer term in that tenancy. So, but it's much more of a prevention element rather than what might be classically sustainment.
Great, thanks, John Mark. Eileen, do you want to come in on that one too?
Yeah, please. From our perspective, we have organisations contracted to provide tenancy sustainment, and it's to provide sustainment when we become aware that there's antisocial behaviour happening, there's something happening that's disturbing the neighbours, or the landlord isn't happy, or there's things happening within the household that are leading to them, or leading to a threat of them losing their house, their tenancy. So then we send in these NGO services to intervene and to link into whatever community sustainment is needed, what help is needed, and try and maintain the tenancy to go forward. It works very well, actually. It's usually for social housing tenancies where there's drug dealing, etc., happening, and it needs to cease because they're destroying the lives of the people, their neighbours, and it's leading to them, you know, eventually they'll lose their home. So it's to put in those supports to them to try and get them to act in a different way so that they can sustain their tenancies. And it's a vital piece. It also works where you have family breakdown happening because of the way a particular member of the household is acting, and we can try and give whatever supports we can link into there. It might be addiction services, mental health services. Hale would do it as well for us with people with mental health tenancies, where their behaviour becomes erratic, and they link them back into the supports that they need. There's a huge amount of work happening in relation to it. The problem is that it's not measured properly for us in that sense. So it's very hard to actually say, whoa, we've saved another 20 tenancies last month by this is tenancy sustainment, but it is happening on the ground.
That's great, thanks, Eileen. Ruth, have you anything to add in terms of the European context? Can you think of any innovative examples of tenancy sustainment on issues perhaps that we haven't touched on?
But perhaps just to say, I think the further you get from a particular context, the more European, maybe the more abstract some of the terms become. So the precise distinction between tenancy sustainment and tenancy protection is maybe less of an issue when you're taking a step back and looking at different practices in the European Union. But I think it's an area of a really big growth and development and innovation in homeless policies and homeless services. One of the interesting things that's happening in Finland now, that they've sort of wrapped up their initial Housing First programs, and they're now really focusing on a homelessness prevention strategy, is a development and promotion of what they call housing social work. And it's just the whole housing dimension of social support to people in vulnerable situations. And I think it's an area that will, if we want to achieve this shift from managing homelessness to ending homelessness, all those kind of services we need to see more of, and more sort of innovation in terms of making sure that they can really respond to the needs of individual households.
Great, thanks, Ruth. Maybe we could just move on from tenancy sustainment now. We have a question here that relates to young people and youth homelessness. I'll read through the question. I think it's directed at you initially, Eileen, but then I'd like to broaden it out. So the question is, young people have specific needs and face unique challenges accessing housing. Apart from CAS for care leavers, what is the DRHE strategy to youth homelessness over the coming years? I'm conscious that that's maybe putting youth homelessness at your feet in terms of DRHE. If you could broaden it out a bit in terms of the whole idea of youth homelessness and the different types of issues that they deal with, and what's being done to combat that?
Well, can I be very blunt? I find it quite insulting that we as a state think we put the two words together, youth and homelessness, and then we expect some arm of the state to take responsibility for it. What are we like? Like, it's just, we should never have those two words in the one sentence. And to actually be delivering it and be charged with putting a policy in place for it is even more bizarre.
Do you think, I suppose where the questions go is, do you think young people have different issues in relation to homelessness than the rest of the population as a whole? Or not? And should it just all be dealt with together in a general homelessness response?
Well, I suppose the whole of the response from the DRHE is for everyone. We don't discern whether people have one leg, two legs, one eye, at what age they are, anything else. We provide emergency accommodation. We put responses in place. We develop policies and strategies to cover any and every scenario. However, youth and children are not the responsibility of housing. And I suppose to think that we would be developing, or anybody would be delivering or developing a policy to deal with youth homelessness as opposed to developing a policy to care for young people just defies logic in my thinking. What are we doing? You know, why are we so, like, it's literally, we're passing the parcel here, or trying to. If there's children and they're homeless and they're, you know, there's a system, there should be a system to care for them. The same as there's a hospital system, a prison system. But it looks to me like we're putting trying to put a policy together to pass the parcel to housing.
Yeah.
Like, we're not, it's not a creche we're running. It's an emergency accommodation for people who are homeless. You know, somebody else, some other department runs the creche.
Yeah.
You know, there are systems there for people who are care leavers, and it works very well. It's not big numbers either, by the way. Let's not get carried away here thinking we've loads and loads and loads of homeless children. We've loads of homeless children in homelessness. That doesn't mean we have to provide accommodation for them. We're providing accommodation for the households. The piece around homeless care leavers, children who are unaccompanied, that's a different scenario. And
yes,
that's what we have creches for. Not homeless facilities.
Thanks, Eileen.
No, it's just bizarre. What are we thinking here? That we would even think like that as a state, that we put a homeless strategy in place for youth. Sorry, I just...
You're fine. I'll give John Walker or Ruth an opportunity to see do either of you two want to come in on that issue.
Well, I can't top that.
Well,
look,
similarly, Mark, when I had my children, I did not think I could hand them to my neighbours at 18.
Yeah, look.
That's what we're trying to do here in my book.
Yeah, I suppose similarly, our services are for tenancies, they're for households, they're for families, they're for individuals. So generally, you know, we'll be working with people who are in a tenancy. And generally, there are some young people. There are generally people who are of working age and across the working age spectrum. So we assist them kind of across the board. I guess the question is, you know, what services and supports do you have for according to various needs? We take a kind of broader view in terms of broader supply, in terms of AHB supply, local authority supply, and the provision of appropriate supports. But of course, our focus would be, and I would say this, wouldn't I, is on prevention, so that, you know, to the best of your, you know, one's ability and any organisation's ability, whether that's statutory or voluntary, you're trying to ensure that people can access housing and can access services, regardless of their particular household or individual situation.
Okay, that's great. Thanks, John Mark. Ruth, have you anything to add to that?
Well, I think I'd maybe just add that there is a growing issue in lots of European countries around young people increasingly turning up in homeless services and experiencing homelessness. And I think one important element of prevention is for states not to take measures that are going to push people into homelessness. And we did see a lot of that after the last financial crisis in terms of cutting in allocations and supports for young people, basically on the assumption that they could rely on their families. Things like reductions in the housing benefit rate for under 35s in the UK, big gaps in access to minimum income between the ages of, say, 18 and 25 in lots of countries. And that's translated into a direct increase in youth homelessness. So I think that's one element of the prevention discussion on this, is like, don't do things that make particular groups much more vulnerable to homelessness. And then I think we're likely to, unfortunately, not see this issue go away as a result of the economic impact of COVID-19. Young people are in the most vulnerable positions on the labour market, and their problems in terms of access to affordable housing are not likely to improve in the near future. So I think it's an issue to which we do need to find solutions, and which is a kind of common European problem.
Yeah. That's great, thanks. We'll have quite a specific question here. Maybe if I stick with you, Ruth, it's quite a specific question in relation to one of the case studies that you had mentioned. You'd spoken about Wales, and in relation to the legislation which give increased requirements to local authorities in dealing with homelessness. And the question is, what supports or additional supports did the local authorities receive, if any, in order to enable them to transition to the new model of prevention?
Yeah, thank you for the question, because I think it's a really good question. It's interesting, maybe, I think, to look at the differences between England and Wales, in that there were quite a lot of supports brought in for local authorities in Wales, both in terms of ring-fenced budgets for the transition, and especially front-loaded to the first couple of years of implementation, to help local authorities make this transition. And in terms of guidance, and that's in a lot of contrast to in England, where this homelessness reduction bill was brought in, but really with very little support to local authorities, and in a context of massive cuts to their budgets, which makes it difficult for them to take on in a meaningful way, I think, these duties.
Okay, that's great, thanks. I have a question here that's maybe a bit, I'm going to ask it anyway. So, would it not be more cost effective to fund public housing, and more importantly, make this accessible to a broad range of the population, not just those marginalised, rather than funding landlords through HAP and general HAP? So I suppose that could be towards Eileen and John Mark first of all. So it's in relation to the provision of public housing, as opposed to the funding of homeless HAP and HAP.
Yeah, I don't know, Eileen, do you want me to go first, or?
Go first.
Okay. It's not either or. I think there's lots of false dichotomies that are placed, and the reality is that the private rented sector is a large and growing part of our housing system, and it will continue to grow both in real terms and I think in relative terms. And there will always be a cohort of a group of people, households, families, who will require some level of housing related income support. And there are innovations in HAP compared to, say, rent supplement, but both have their place for different reasons. And even if we were to kind of move to, say, a very, very broad provision of kind of both social housing and even affordable housing en masse, you'll still, you know, and I don't think that's the stated strategy of government. But even if we were, right, you'd still need something like HAP in place for many years to address need. So I think it's both. It's about ambitious building of both private sector housing, local authority housing, approved housing body housing. Very importantly now, and this is now coming on stream, there's a pilot project right now, I think it's TUA and Respond, through the affordable rental. We'll see more of that hopefully in the coming years. We are seeing a ramping up, even in spite of COVID, of social housing delivery. So these are all kind of positive things, and will require, for the foreseeable future, HAP or a HAP-like payment. And again, I think, you know, prevention services are key. I would say that, wouldn't I? But I do think prevention services are absolutely key. Wherever you have a rental market, you will require, you know, advice. You'll require those tailored services within something like the private rented sector, because it isn't the social rented sector, and you do have a good number of households who will struggle from time to time for a whole variety of reasons, maybe to do with household income, maybe to do with the actions of landlords, maybe to do with other factors. So I think it's about a suite of interventions that you kind of dial up and you dial down over time according to the data that you have, according to the kind of the trends and the patterns that emerge at local and state level.
Great, thanks, John Mark. Eileen, do you want to come in on that?
Yeah, I mean, I concur with what John Mark is saying. It's not either or. There are a lot of people in a homeless HAP and HAP who are quite happy to be in the private rented market, and who actually feel that they're not stigmatized by the fact that they're in private rented. They're not sticking out that they're in social housing. They're getting on with their lives, and it's about choice, giving people choices. The bit about, yes, definitely the social housing delivery needs to, and the Rebuilding Ireland plan was there to get those numbers moving. There's a pent-up demand on it, but while that happens, we have to manage this issue of people needing housing in some way, and homeless HAP, long-term leasing, using the private stock that's there is the solution for now, until we can level it back up again to the delivery. Sometimes from this side of the house, there's a disconnect between delivery of social housing and a type of social housing across on particular sites that are owned or not owned by the local authorities, and the actual need that's there. So sometimes the people who want and need housing don't care whether it's in the private or the public. You know, it's ideology rather than anything else. People want housing, and as long as we can do it, whichever way we can do it, we're meeting the need. And we probably shouldn't be getting caught up so much on this public-private provision. Yes, of course, it gives us more control in the long term if it's in the social side of the provision, publicly owned housing. But is that exactly what everybody needs or wants? Not necessarily. So it's about giving choices to people, giving them options, and the main thing is about providing accommodation for them when, and long-term secure accommodation for them when they need it.
Yeah, that's great. Thanks, Eileen. I think we've got through most of the questions now. I see one here, maybe we'll end up with this one. I see one here in terms of measurement of success. So the question is, what gets measured gets funded? And picking up on Eileen's point in relation to not measuring the success of tenancy sustainment, is there potential to measure prevention services in a different way in order to rebalance the funding going towards prevention and long-term solutions rather than emergency? So I suppose some things in the prevention realm are easier measured than others? And is there a different way or alternative way of measuring success for prevention methods? So I'm not sure who wants to kick off on that one. I suppose
I'll kick off if you don't mind. I suppose we're measuring preventions, but we're measuring preventions in relation to those who are prevented with homeless HAP, really, or prevented from entering emergency accommodation. And we're very successful with that. And in the since 2017, we've had over 6,000 preventions, people who never entered emergency accommodation, families, households. And at the same time, we've had the same number who've exited out of emergency accommodation into. The piece about measuring the tenancy sustainment, if you measure it, we do need to measure it in some way, but unfortunately society labels people as homeless. So are we measuring them then as being prevented from being homeless, so that they get the homeless label slapped on them anyway? So it's difficult to do it in a way that you don't end up categorizing people as opposed to supporting them, if you get my argument or my point.
Yeah, I get
we're all killed trying to look up homeless numbers all over the place. If somebody dies, it's handy to stick a homeless label on them, and then that defines them. And it's just going to be the same with the protection piece and the sustainment piece, because it was preventing them from becoming homeless. Well, then are they homeless anyway? And, you know, will we count them that way? It's just, we need to be careful how it's done, as opposed to anything else. But we have the prevention piece from the homeless HAP, which are numbers that we have that can go, are real preventions in that sense. They prevented people from ever experiencing homeless emergency accommodation. They never got a pass ID on our system. They were never counted, but they are counted as preventions. So it's that, how you do it, how you measure it, without labeling.
How you package it and how you frame it. Yeah, that's great, Eileen. That's really interesting points. Ruth or John Mark, do either of you want to come in on this issue?
Yeah, just quickly. Yeah, I mean, we record according to whether or not the person is presenting with an issue which really seriously puts their tenancy at risk, and then over time we can chart whether or not they were, if you like, their tenancy was saved from being lost, if you like. So there's always a lag time in those figures, but yeah, it's something that we're regularly recording, and it was part of my presentation.
That's great. Thanks, John Mark. Ruth, have you anything to add to that?
Maybe just to say, I think a lot of homelessness prevention policies are measured up until the point where they divert someone from the homeless system, but they don't really look at outcomes beyond that. I think it would be useful to have more cohort studies and more long-term follow-up to see what happens to people over a longer trajectory. And then maybe just to link it back to Housing First, I do think one of the reasons that Housing First is part of all of our conversations is because it is a very unusual in terms of the amount of research and evidence that exists about its effectiveness with these large randomized control trials that have been done. And I think there's scope to do more of that kind of research into homelessness prevention interventions.
Okay, that's great. Thanks very much. I think we'll draw to a close. We've got through the questions here that I can see. So on behalf of the Housing Agency, I'd like to thank our three speakers today for three excellent presentations, and thank you for taking the time out of your day to join us and give the presentations. And I hope everybody in the audience has found it as informative and inspiring as I have. For all the attendees, you will receive a link to the presentations that have been made today, and they're also in your control panel as well. So on behalf of the Housing Agency, I'd like to thank the speakers and attendees for today. Thanks very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you to all attendees. We're now going to finish the conference. Have a great day.